Ever wonder what secrets were stewing behind the swinging doors of a dusty old Wild West saloon? Not the brawls, not the bullets, but the bizarre, belly-churning food that kept gunfighters and gamblers on their feet. Picture this. You're starving, broke, and stepping into a room that smells like a horse's regrets, and you're hoping to find dinner. What exactly was on the plate? Spoiler alert. It wasn't just beans and bravado. Buckle up, partners, because tonight we're diving into the greasy, gritty guts of frontier cuisine, the stuff they don't put in cowboy movies. But first, hit that like button and subscribe if you actually enjoy uncovering the weird, the wild, and the occasionally edible past. And hey, drop a comment with where you're tuning in from and what hour of madness your clock show sits. Always a kick to see who's curious about cowboy chow in the middle of the night. Now, dim the lights, crank up that fan for an ambient breeze, and let's drift into the shadows of the old frontier. The very first thing to hit your face as you stepped inside a saloon wasn't the piano twang or the drunk howling about losing his mule in a poker game. It was the smell. Not a charming whiff of cornbread and brisquetat, no. Think more along the lines of damp leather, ashtray breath, whiskey sweat, unwashed boots, rotting floorboards, and maybe, if the wind was feeling merciful, a ghost of stew wafting in from the back room. Some barkeeps tried to wrestle the stench with sawdust showers on the floor, or pipe smoke thick enough to make you forget your own name. Others gave up. Ain't here for a whiff of daisies? They'd grunt, swatting flies off the bar with a rag older than the saloon itself. But somehow, in that pungent purgatory, food was being cooked. Maybe it was an iron skillet hung over open flames where beans gurgled ominously. Maybe it was old Granny Bramblean, ex-widow, turned cook-wielding a ladle like a war club and muttering curses into her cauldron of God knows what. One way or another, if you could sniff it through the beer fog and body odor, you were halfway to a meal. That is, assuming you could find a seat before a drunk outlaw claimed your kneecaps. These saloons didn't run like modern diners. No polished menus or cheerful waiters, just a haphazard sprawl of battered tables, three-legged chairs, and a long bar that served as dining room, courtroom, and occasional battlefield. If you were a local, you might hear the cook holler, "Beans or sludge?" and you'd holler back your poison without looking up. If you were fresh off the stagecoach, every gaze turned your way like vultures sizing up a limping rabbit, wondering if you'd pay your tab or collapse in your soup. But that unpredictability was the charm. Saloon dining wasn't about flavor, it was about fortitude. You chewed what they gave you. You dined beside people who might mug you or marry you. And if the mystery meat made you queasy, the whiskey was strong enough to kill most bacteria, or at least your memory of it. In the wild and lawless food chain of the West, one thing reigned supreme: the humble bean. Not because it delighted the taste buds, but because it was apocalypse-proof. Pinto, black, navy didn't matter. If it was dry, vaguely nutritious, and didn't scream when you boiled it, it was dinner. Beans were the backbone of the bullet dodging, beer slamming, backroom brawling culinary scene of the frontier. At night, when the desert air turned sharp and silent, hungry drifters crowded saloons for meals that hadn't seen a vegetable since Missouri. The chef's process? Not exactly Michelin-starred. Step 1. Dump a heap of beans into a battered pot. Step 2. Boil them over a flickering fire fueled by questionable wood, dry dung, or both. Step 3. Serve them with a chunk of salt-soaked pork, a biscuit hard enough to chip teeth, and the kind of apologetic look that said, "I'm sorry, but it's food." Some cooks got daring. Old Maggie Flint once tossed in chopped onions, a spoon of lard, or if the stars aligned, a dash of chili powder. But most let the breeze decide the seasoning, because in Dead Gulch, flavor was for rich folks and fools. Beans were everything. Heavy, honest, and humbly reliable, three traits more valuable than gold teeth in a poker den. They fueled saddle-bound cattle runs, fueled endless poker games, and gave jittery cowhands something to gnaw while waiting for Jed, the one-eyed pianist, to slam the keister for someone to fly through the front window. But there was a price. The aftermath. One man on beans? Containable. 10 men in a confined room after a pot of overcooked legumes? That wasn't dinner, it was warfare. Folks said more saloon brawls started from silent eruptions than actual insults. Yet, no matter how explosive the side effects, beans stayed loyal. When the meat ran dry, when the hens vanished, and when Cookie Joe's brain cooked in the whiskey haze, those beans soldiered on indestructible, unapologetic, and ever-present. Some writers even grew to prefer them. Cold or hot, beans didn't discriminate. You could reheat them a dozen times, or trade them for goods if desperate. Legend whispers that Rufus Tin Tooth McGraw once bought a half-dead horse with 3 pounds of salted beans and a promise to never show his face again. And that's the essence of saloon cuisine. Highs and lows. But beans? Beans were the dependable drumbeat, the humble heartbeat of the frontier's belly. You didn't crave them. You didn't even like them. But you respected them. And in those parts, respect went further than taste. Now, if beans were the dependable soul of the Wild West's warped kitchen, salt pork was its greasier, backbonian, indestructible slab of pig belly tough enough to survive hailstorms, hangovers, and 6 months stuffed in a saddlebag. Salt pork wasn't bacon, though a lot of dusty desperados lied to themselves about that. It was pork belly preserved in barrels of brine potent enough to embalm a buffalo. The salt kept it from rotting, and arguably from ever being truly edible. Done right, it was crispy, sizzling, and filled the room with a savory sizzle that gave you hope. For a few blessed bites, it made you forget that the rest of your meal came from a rusty can. Done wrong, and that was more common, it tasted like a greased boot heel dipped in despair, but cowboys loved it. You couldn't ruin it easily, though some tried their best stand. Even the saddest pot of beans perked up with a fatty punch of pork. Saloons didn't waste a shred. That precious fat fried everything. Potatoes, flapjacks, even biscuits. The rubbery rind? Tossed into stews or slipped to mangy dogs or worse, given to clueless newcomers who'd never had the pleasure of learning what not to chew. One bite, and they'd be warned for life. The barkeep's advice rang true: chew slow or choke proud. And sure, sometimes that pork had a hint of green, or a smell that suggested it had walked here on its own. But out west, the question wasn't, is it fresh? It was, did it kill the last guy? If the answer was no, you gave it a go. Salt pork could be chopped into beans, stacked on bread, fried alone, or chewed like jerky across the plains. Cowboys carried it like gold coins, and when all else failed, when the stew thinned out and chickens took off, running salt pork stepped in. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't good for you. But it was there, and in the Wild West, that was enough. In a land where you could ride 60 bone-rattling miles before seeing a single steaming plate, salt pork wasn't just food, it was survival. If you lived through the chew, you came out tougher, more seasoned, and possibly slightly salted yourself. But when it came to true culinary democracy in the Wild West, one dish ruled the plate stew. Hot, murky, questionably meaty, and comfortingly vague. It was the great equalizer. No matter how busted the saloon or how distracted the cook, there was almost always a pot bubbling in the back. Why? Because stew was the original edible Olivia cauldron of chaos, where no one asked questions and everything found a home. The formula was simple: a pot, a flame, and a bold disregard for ingredients. Start with water, toss in whatever looked edibler, simply gave up running, and let fate simmer. Beef if you were lucky. Rabbit if someone got a shot off. Squirrel, often. Rattlesnake if recently deceased. One traveler at Widow Knox's saloon swore he found a bootlace in his bowl. He didn't complain it. Had texture. Meat ranged from genuinely tender butcher cuts to, well, meat. If the cook looked jumpy and the town dogs were missing, folks learned to chew carefully and avoid eye contact. Vegetables made rare guest appearances and were quickly annihilated. Carrots melted into orange smears. Onions vanished without a trace. Potatoes held their dignity a bit longer before succumbing. The end result? A bubbling slurry of brownish-gray mystery, which somehow always smelled far better than it looked and tasted decent if you braved the salt. Spices were mythical. Most flavor came from whatever the cook had last touched. If you got black pepper, you were in an establishment of distinction. Chili powder meant your nose was about to be evicted forcibly from your face. Still, stew was a weary cowboy's hug in a bowl. hot, filling, and infinitely stretchable. One pot could feed a dozen men, or be reheated 3 days straight until it developed its own emotional baggage. You didn't eat stew for taste, you ate it because it was hot. It was there, and every other option in town either came with a warning label or legs. Rule number 1, never ask what's in the stew. Out west, ignorance wasn't just bliss, it was your best defense against indigestion and existential crisis. Now, not every drifter had the coin for a steak, but almost every saloon had something bread adjacent to go with the goop. Usually, it came in two very different forms. On one hand, soft, flaky biscuits that, when made right, could convince a man he'd accidentally stepped into a dream. On the other hand, hardtack bread's undead cousin. Let's start with the good news. Biscuits. When a cook actually knew what they were doing, and that was rarer than rain, they came out warm, buttery, and flaky enough to make a gunman drop his six-shooter in awe. Cooks who mastered biscuits became local lore. Some claimed their secret was rendered bear lard. Others swore by buttermilk swiped from sleeping cows. Most just got lucky and prayed hard. These miracle biscuits were best paired with beans or stew, perfect for sopping up the bottom of the bowl before it solidified into history. They were baked in cast iron skillets, open fire kissed, and sometimes served with a suspicious lump of butter or a molasses drizzle if the saloon was putting on airs. And then there was hardtack, a slab of flour and water baked until it could deflect bullets. Originally invented for sailors and soldiers who hated themselves, it drifted west because, like tumbleweeds and bad luck, it refused to die. It never spoiled, mainly because nothing could live in it. Calling it food was an act of generosity. Eating it required planning. First, you checked it for weevils, not because you wouldn't eat it if they were there, but because it was polite to know what was crunching. Then you soaked it in stew, coffee, or straight whiskey until it surrendered. This could take anywhere from 10 minutes to a full presidential term. Even then, it fought back. Hardtack didn't feed you. It challenged you. Hardtack wasn't just a snack, it was a confrontation. You didn't bite it, you wrestled it. Dentists in frontier towns probably retired early thanks to cowboys who took one chomp too many and lost half their molars to a flour brick baked in hell. But the thing is, both biscuits and hardtack did what needed doing. They were cheap. They traveled well. They filled your belly like a dependable punch to the gut. And out in the frontier, where calories trumped taste every time, that was more than enough. If you stumbled into a grimy saloon and caught sight of fresh biscuits, it was like spotting a unicorn in a poncho. You counted your blessings, then your teeth. If instead, you got handed a palm-sized disc of jawbreaker bread, well, it came with a story and possibly a dental emergency. Now, you think your morning espresso is bold? Try facing a tin cup of cowboy coffee, the original black magic. This stuff didn't just wake you up, it challenged you to a staring contest. It wasn't brewed with fancy beans, filtered through sleek gadgets, or crowned with oat milk hearts. It was ground like graveler, not at all dumped into whatever kettle wasn't rusted through, then boiled until the liquid was less beverage and more trial by fire. The recipe? Pure chaos. Scoop water from whatever didn't have fish floating belly up. Dump in coffee grounds using rage instead of measurements. Boil until it hissed. No straining, no questions. Pour it and brace your soul. What you got was a mug of steaming bitterness that smelled like scorched ambition and tasted like your worst decision. That last mouthful, mostly grit and sorrow. But hey, caffeine and fiber in one heroic gulp. And the cowboys loved it. That hell brew got them through freezing sunrises and sleepless desert nights. It fought hangovers, it dulled the stew's mystery meat, and it gave you something hot to hold, even if it scalded the skin right off. Not every saloon served coffee, only the ones with a half-decent kitchen or a grizzled barkeep with a heart, but when they did, it came out boiling, black as the devil's humor, and strong enough to strip varnish. One cowboy said it was like getting kicked in the teeth by a caffeinated mullion, that he missed it every time he left town. If you were feeling fancy, you might score a spoonful of sugar or a splash of canned milk, but most folks just stared death in the face and drank it straight. And if that pot had been reheated all day, Congratulations. You are now sipping from a bitter, bubbling cauldron of revenge. Some cooks even reused old grounds to stretch the supply, creating a brew so bland it tasted like the ghost of coffee past. But it still counted, because in the Wild West, you didn't drink coffee for joy. You drank it to survive and remember why you should stay awake. And when it came to meat, things got even more adventurous. Out there, meat wasn't just food. It was currency, pride, and sometimes a personal dare. If you had coin and confidence, you might waltz into Miss Lottie's place and ask for steak. What you got, however, depended entirely on luck, timing, and whether the cook was holding a grudge. Steak, in theory, was a luxury. In reality, it was often a leathery slab of beef charred into submission in a greasy pan. Served so overdone it, apologize when you cut it. Ask for medium rare, and prepare to be stared at until your mustache drooped in shame. More often than not, fresh beef was a fantasy. When it wasn't available, which was almost always, saloons leaned into what they had. Dried jerky, buffalo salted into oblivion, the occasional chunk of venison, or wild boar if someone got real lucky on the hunt. And by lucky, we mean they managed to shoot it and haul it back before the vultures claimed the prize. In mining camps or desolate trail stops, things got creative. Jackrabbit roast, squirrel stew, rattlesnake kebabs with a pinch of mystery seasoning. If it had legs and didn't belong to a patron's horse, it went in the pan. Sometimes you got meat, and no one said a word about what it was. That was your cue. Chew slowly, don't ask questions, and hope it wasn't last night's missing raccoon. If you chewed too long and hit something that felt like a whisker, you didn't panic, you just took a sip of your whiskey, gave a solemn nod like a man accepting his fate, and carried on. Age was another hazard. Some meats had lingered so long in the pantry, the kitchen staff gave them nicknames. Cooks sliced off the offending bits, drowned the rest in thick brown gravy, and called it well-aged with a straight face. If your dinner flinched when you jabbed it with a fork, you were allowed one eyebrow, raise nothing more. But every so often, if fortune smiled and the cook hadn't passed out in the lard bucket, you might land a real plate of food. A sizzling slab of beef, a golden fried egg lounging on top, and maybe just maybe a warm biscuit on the side. A meal that made you understand why people ducked bullets to sit at this table. Most of the time, though, you didn't dine, you gambled. You ate what was set in front of you and prayed it didn't try to eat you back. As for dessert, that wasn't exactly a defined concept in a Wild West saloon. It was more of a rare mercy, a surprise act of kindness from a cook with too much cornmeal and half a soul. But if there was one sweet comfort you could sometimes count on, it was cornbread, the unsung hero of the frontier menu. Made from cornmeal, milk, or water, a spoon of lard, and maybe baking powder if someone was feeling generous or found a tin of it behind the bar. Cornbread was the multi-tool of cowboy carbs, baked in cast iron pans, fried into golden cakes, or dropped in blobs into stew when patience wore thin. On its own, it was dry, a bit crumbly, sometimes sweet, and almost always better than nothing, which was often the alternative. Of course, it was rarely fresh. More often, it was a hardened wedge that had been keeping company with the stove since sunrise, tougher than a sheriff's patience, and about as forgiving. But then came the miracle ingredient, molasses. Dark, thick, sticky redemption in syrup form. One drizzle, and that sad slab of cornbread transformed into something almost divine. Molasses was cheap, kept well in the desert heat, and could make even the most tragic baked goods sing. If the saloon had a barrel of it, you were living large. If they served it warm, you were dining in what passed for luxury out west. Some daring cooks even fried their cornbread in skillets, poured hot molasses over the top, and added a whisper of salt or a flick of cinnamon if they'd recently robbed a spice wagon. It wasn't cake, but after a week of chewing jerky and staring down strangers, it felt like one. Cornbread with molasses became the default dessert. It was fast, filling, sweet enough to settle nerves, frayed by near-death poker hands and wayward bullets. And for most, it was more than enough. Because in a world full of cattle stampedes, knife fights, and daily dehydration, Dessert didn't need to spark light, just needed to remind you that not everything in the Wild West was out to kill you. And if, by some cosmic alignment, you wandered into a saloon before noon, preferably not limping or bleeding, you might have been offered something sacred, eggs and chicken. And when that happened, you were either blessed or being set up for disappointment. Let's start with the eggs. Fresh eggs out there were like unicorns wrapped in gold. Not literally valuable, but rare enough to be treasured. Chickens weren't pets, they were attitude-riddled freeloaders who wandered off, got snatched by coyotes, or were stolen by the cook for dinner. If a saloon served eggs, they either had a secret coop, a deal with Farmer Bill 2 hills over, or a very creative black market. What kind of eggs? Ideally chicken, possibly duck. Potentially something that once chirped. You didn't ask. You said eggs, and the kitchen gods gave you whatever passed the sniff test. Scrambled to hide their age, or fried until yolks cooked into something that crunched like boot leather. And if that egg jiggled when it hit your plate, that was less breakfast and more divine warning. Better to abandon the fork, order whiskey, and accept your fate. Now, chicken. It existed on menus, but rarely in the form it promised. If you saw fried chicken scribbled on a chalkboard, brace yourself. What you'd likely get was a wiry little beast that looked like it lost a fight on the way to the skillet, tough, stubborn, fried in 3-day-old lard, and stripped of flavor halfway through cooking. It wasn't always worth the jaw workout, but it was hot, it was meat, and praise beat wasn't beans again. That was enough for most. You might receive a drumstick the size of a matchstick or a scorched thigh quarter that still had embers clinging to it. Bonus flavor if you found a feather stuck in your gravy. That was just frontier charm. Eggs and chicken on a saloon breakfast table weren't just food, they were status. A symbol that said, this place offers meals not entirely sourced from cans in desperation. If the eggs were warm and the chicken wasn't jerky in disguise, you'd brag about it for weeks. And if it left you clutching your stomach later, that was just the West, keeping you humble. Still, there was optimism in ordering eggs. They whispered of dawn, of survival, of maybe just maybe seeing sundown with your boots still on and a second drink in hand. Now, about pie. In a Wild West saloon, pie wasn't just dessert, it was a declaration. If you stepped inside and saw one on the bar, steam rising like a beacon, crust golden, and a sweet perfume of apples cutting through the barroom funk, you knew you'd stumbled into somewhere special. A place with pride, a place with pie. But don't let your imagination run wild. Wild West pie wasn't some pristine lattice-crusted slice of orchard glory. It was rugged, rustic, a crusty ode to improvisation. Uneven tops, gooey fillings, scraped together from canned peaches, dried apples, or whatever passed for berries that week. Whipped cream? Only if a cow followed you in and volunteered. Apple, peach, and berry were the staples, though berry often included raisins, dark figs, or things that once aspired to be fruit. If your cook had a sweet tooth, you might get a blessed pinch of cinnamon. If not, you got dry crust, rough sugar, and a prayer. Still, pie was rare gold. Most cowboys hadn't seen one since they left their mama's porch, and saloons that served pie knew they had leverage. A decent slice could pull travel-weary customers from 2 towns over. A great slice? That could start a shootout. There are true tales and even wilder rumors of poker games ending with pistols drawn over the last triangle of apple glory. You took the last slice, carried as much weight as you cheated at cards. In a land where men bled over spilled whiskey, pie had power. Not all pies were winners. Some were mostly shell. Some tasted like they'd been filled with regret and pipe ash. Others were strange fruit experiments gone wrong. But if the stars aligned, the oven stayed hot, and the cook hadn't passed out near the stove, a good pie could become legend. Because in the dust-choked wilderness of the frontier, a slice of pie wasn't just something to eat, it was hope, served warm on a tin plate. Cheese, on the other hand. Cheese in the Wild West was a gamble, a culinary poker hand with more bluff than bite, and a strong likelihood you'd regret it before sunrise. Sure, it existed, but only in dim corners, and only if you were brave or foolish enough to ask. It wasn't wrapped in paper or aged in tidy cellars. It was local, homemade, usually crafted by someone who'd once heard about fermentation in a bar argument. You didn't get a cheese plate, you got a choice. Hard, yellow, and suspiciously shiny, or soft, crumbly, and with a smell strong enough to fight back. Cheese was an experience. Refrigeration in the Wild West was about as common as a polite outlaw. If it wasn't the dead of winter, or your saloon was conveniently built next to a cool cave, chances were your cheese had aged itself into a sentient being. Maybe it started life as cheddar. Maybe something vaguely Swiss. Or maybe it was just a salty, slightly squishy mystery wrapped in wax paper and false hope. If it squeaked when you bit into it, that was a personal matter between you and your molars. Most often, cheese arrived in rough chunks, served alongside stale bread, a strip of jerky, or, on especially good days, a lone pickle floating in vinegar like a prize in a jar. It cut through the salt, gave your jaw something new to wrestle, and added a protein boost in between saloon scuffles. Sometimes, cooks got inspired and melted it over beans or toasted it atop cornbread like culinary art class in a thunderstorm. But beware, some saloons took shortcuts so wild they should have been outlawed. Cheese could mean anything from spoiled butter turned experimental to curdled milk pressed into a bar and dusted with black pepper as camouflage. One traveling merchant swore he bought cheese in Dead Man's Notch that tasted like boiled boot lining with a bark. He finished every bite because even bad cheese was still cheese. And any saloon bold enough to serve it stood out like a sheriff in sequins. It meant the owner either had a farm connection or a cow that hadn't yet been kidnapped. Offering cheese wasn't about the taste, it was a declaration of status, a flex. A sign that, yes, amidst the gunfire and sandbaths, someone here had managed to culture milk into something semi-solid and serve it with pride. So if your plate came with a slab of yellow mystery, you sniffed it, tapped it, gave it a long, meaningful stare, then ate it anyway. Because in the West, food was always a gamble, and cheese, that was a high-stakes bet wrapped in dairy and hope. Now, if it could be drowned in vinegar and forgotten in a jar, it probably ended up on a saloon shelf. Pickling wasn't about enhancing flavor, it was a survival tactic. Before cold storage, kitchens turned to brine and sour magic to keep food from walking away on its own. Veggies, eggs, fruit, meat, nothing was safe. Thus was born the tangy, tough world of pickled everything. Pickled cucumbers were the classic, snappy, sour, and suspiciously green. Served as chasers for bad whiskey or something to gnaw between foolish bets, they were either spiked with garlic and chili if the cook had ambitions or tasted like moldy fence posts. Pickled eggs, saloon staples. Floating behind the bar in jars cloudy enough to hide their age, they looked like haunted eyeballs. Their texture, rubbery despair. Some cowboys swore by them as instant protein hits. Others just swore. Pickled onions were popular in mining towns, sharp enough to clean your sinuses and your social calendar. One bite could clear a saloon faster than a gunshot. Even pickled peaches or pears made appearances as dried fruits, resurrected in sweet brine that blurred the line between dessert and dare. They weren't dinner. They weren't dessert. They were edible confusion. Sweet, sour, and oddly compelling. And the best part? They lasted forever. Pickled goods could sit on shelves for months, even years, without turning hostile. In a place where meat spoiled faster than tempers, that made them invaluable. But let's not pretend they were always safe. Jars weren't always sealed right. Sometimes the cook got creative. Sometimes the pickled items looked back. Tales circulate, some probably true, pickled sausages with bones still in, or labels that read, probably pork. Still, they were part of the West's weird, wonderful foodscape. Salty, sour, sometimes alarming, but always ready for action. You didn't eat them for joy. You ate them because they probably wouldn't kill you. Probably. When food ran scarce, the kitchen closed early, or the stew looked like it might bite back. Cowboys and wanderers turned to the one menu item that never let them down: whiskey. Always present, never overcooked, whiskey didn't need a recipe or a fire. It needed a bottle, a will to forget, and maybe a half-functioning liver. In the Wild West, whiskey wasn't swirled and sniffed or praised for oak notes. It was brutal, unfiltered, sometimes flammable, distilled in barns, back rooms, and bathtubs using corn, rye, or whatever wasn't nailed down. The final product could sanitize a bullet wound, dissolve paint, and spark a brawl faster than you could say cheers. Some called it gut fire, others mule kick, and a few simply called it lunch. When beans were burned and the bread was green, men drank their calories one searing gulp at a time. Because out here, whiskey wasn't just a drink, it was a lifeline. It numbed the sting of saddle rash, heartbreak, busted ribs, and whatever mystery meat just tried to crawl off your plate. 1 shot before a duel, 2 after, and 3 while waiting to see if you'd wake up again. It was therapy in a glass and courage in a bottle. Saloons often bundled it into whiskey specials. A glass of burn, your eyebrows, off hooch served with a dry biscuit or a scoop of beans. Not for taste, just to anchor you upright. Some regulars ordered it with a pickled egg floating inside, which counted as both hydration and lunch, depending on your level of desperation. And whiskey? It was the social currency of the frontier. You bought it to celebrate, to start fights, and if the night went sideways, to apologize. The strength of a saloon's liquor could be measured by how fast it toppled a full-grown man from his stool. As for quality, don't ask. Sometimes it was no more than tinted moonshine. Additives ranged from tobacco spit to gunpowder. If it went down smooth, you were either unconscious or drinking lantern oil. But nobody complained. Because whiskey was the only thing that was always honest. It didn't pretend to be fancy. It burned like truth and stayed cheap. And on nights when your whole meal came in a glass, with no fork and no judgment, you raised it skyward and called it dinner. Behind every smoky, grease-slicked saloon that dared to serve meals, there lurked a figure of unpredictable power, the cook. This soot-streaked specter often wielded more authority than the bartender, sheriff, and town preacher combined. Always cranky, rarely clean-shaven, and never to be trifled with, the cook was either a culinary savior or a taste bud terrorist. There was no middle ground. You might never see them smile, but you'd remember their work sometimes in gratitude, sometimes through lingering trauma. These weren't trained chefs. Most were ex-miners, ex-convicts, or just ex-somethings with a deep understanding of fire and no fear of expired meat. Their kitchen? A scorched fire pit, a dented stove, and one sacred cast-iron skillet that hadn't been properly washed since the Comet Gold Rush, and yet they fed entire towns with it. On their best days, they produced chili so rich it made hardened men weep. Biscuits came out warm, beans were soft, and cornbread tasted like distant memories of childhood. But on bad days, the beans were blackened, the meat looked undead, and the stew shimmered with an oil slick that moved like it was plotting something. Still, you didn't dare complain, ever. Saloon rules were simpler than ever in Salt the Cook. They controlled the salt, the grease, and most importantly, your mystery meat ratio. If they liked you, you got the good stuff. If not, you got the burned bottom scraped up, reboiled, and served with a wink as chili surprise. They also pulled double duty as the saloon's unofficial bouncer. You didn't want to catch a cast iron ladle to the face, especially one fresh from a pork frying frenzy. And if that cook had a cleaver, and they usually did, they could clear a saloon faster than a shotgun blast. But moods aside, those cooks were indispensable. They kept cowboys upright, miners from blacking out, and travelers from collapsing mid-sentence with hunger. They worked through smoke, fire, and profanity, took insults as seasoning, and lived by one sacred motto: if you don't like it, there's the door, or the whiskey. Whether they saved your hide with stew or sabotaged your stomach with spoiled eggs, you always gave the cook a respectful nod. Because in the Wild West, they didn't just hold the frying pan, they held your fate in their greasy, battle-hardened hands. So now that we've stepped through the creaky saloon doors, inhaled questionable stew fumes, and locked eyes with a pickled egg suspended in murky brine, the question remains: would you eat the food in a Wild West saloon? Let's be real, modern taste buds might not survive the experience. The beans were bland, the meat suspicious, and the stew, well, it had more mystery than substance. You'd need teeth of steel, a gut lined in iron, and an appetite born of 40 sun-scorched miles on horseback, with nothing in your mouth but dust and regret. But for the cowboys, gamblers, gold diggers, and fugitives of the frontier, saloon food wasn't about flavor. It was about fuel, calories, heat. A warm plate wedged between a bar fight and a train robbery, or one last bite before curling up in a haystack beside a mule named Bad Decision. You didn't nitpick the menu. You didn't ask what animal that jerky came from. You sat down, nodded at the cook, and ate like your next meal wasn't promised, which it often wasn't. If the food was good, if the beans weren't burnt, the coffee didn't taste like punishment, and the cornbread had a kiss of molasses. It felt like divine intervention. Would you eat it? If you lived back then, you'd do more than eat it, you'd bless it. You'd scrape your tin bowl clean, mop it with a hunk of bread, and slap down coins still warm from your boot heel. You'd laugh with strangers, curse the cook affectionately, raise your whiskey, and maybe if fortune smiled into your night with a slice of pie and a tale worth passing down. Because saloon food wasn't elegant. It was rough, relentless, and real. And in a land where the West was still wild, that was good enough. Long before tattoos were inked under neon lights in polished shops buzzing with steel needles, body markings had a deeper purpose, each not for fashion, but for meaning, mystery, and survival. To find the origin, we travel far back before cities had names, before gods had temples, when humanity walked the earth barefoot and spirit-bound. Enter the Iceman. Found in 1991, frozen high in a glacier along the Austria-Italy border, his mummified body stunned the world. Ötzi, as he was named, had been dead over 5,000 years, older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge. And yet, carved across his ancient, leathery skin were signs of something eerily modern, tattoos, 61 of them to be exact. Not decorative swirls or symbols of beauty, but dark carbon lines and dots. They trailed down his spine, curled behind his knees, and circled his ankles. And here's where things get strange. The placement of Ötzi's tattoos corresponded with known acupuncture point spots on the body, where modern medicine applies pressure to relieve pain. Was this the earliest known form of pain therapy? A prehistoric healing ritual? Or something deeper, an endurance rite etched into the body, soul, and scar tissue? We may never know the full truth. But what is clear is this: even in the Stone Age, humans were already turning their skin into a canvas of meaning. And Ötzi was not alone. In ancient Egypt, tattoos weren't flirty butterflies or the names of fleeting lovers. They were sacred scripts inked into the flesh of women, particularly priestesses and temple dancers. These weren't fashion statements. They were spiritual armor. Patterns etched around the abdomen, thighs, and chest believed to offer protection during childbirth, summon fertility, or ward off lurking evil. Each dot and line was a prayer made permanent, a shield drawn in ink. In Nubia, just south of Egypt, archaeologists uncovered mummified bodies bearing animal tattoos, bulls, crocodiles, fierce symbols of power, endurance, and survival. In these early civilizations, tattoos weren't rebellion, they were reverence. Every prick of ink carried purpose. Every scar was a statement. They spoke of ritual, of identity, of belief held so tightly it was embedded under the skin. So next time you spot a modern sleeve of ink at the gym, in traffic, or on the subway, pause. What you're seeing isn't just a design, it's the distant echo of a tradition born in ice, desert, and divine silence. Think tattoos are just edgy accessories? Try saying that in front of a Polynesian chief and see how fast the laughter dies. In Polynesian culture, ink was not optional, it was sacred. The very word tattoo comes from the Tahitian word tatau, meaning to strike, and that's exactly how it began. With soot-blackened bone tools and tapping sticks, each strike carved identity into flesh like a tribal heartbeat passed down through generations. In Samoa, Tonga, and especially among the Maori of New Zealand, tattoos weren't just decoration, they were your moko, your truth written in blood and ink. Intricate facial patterns could tell an entire story: lineage, social status, family roots, and personal triumphs. The face was not merely skin, it was autobiography. To lose it was to lose your entire history. Young men received their first tattoos during grueling rites of passage. This wasn't a Saturday night impulse after one too many drinks. It was ceremony. It was soul deep. There were no anesthetics, no numbing creams, just willpower, and the belief that pain was the price of meaning. Women, too, wore ink with prettier lips, chin, thighs. Marks of maturity, beauty, and Manatee sacred force, believed to bind all life. A woman without tattoos was not finished. She was a canvas yet to speak. Then came colonialism, and, as it tends to do, it tried to scrub out what it couldn't understand. Missionaries arrived with scissors, soap, and shame. They labeled these ancient practices primitive, savage, unchristian. In some places, traditional tattooing was outlawed, forced underground, spoken only in whispers like a forbidden prayer. But the ink never vanished. It went quiet, not extinct. Today, across the Pacific, the sound of tattoo has returned. The tapping tools strike again. Designs once buried now bloom boldly on new generations. And in that rhythm, you can hear survival, defiance, and pride. These marks aren't trends. They're declarations of spirit, of ancestry, of belonging. Ink isn't just skin deep. It runs to the bone. Now, step into the marble halls of ancient Greece and Rome, a world of philosophers, warriors, and togas. Not exactly the place you'd expect to find ink, right? After all, we imagine those societies through pristine, statuesque, flawless bodies carved from white stone. But peel back the marble myth, and you'll find something darker hiding beneath. Tattoos. In early Greece, tattoos weren't symbols of glory. They were branding irons for shame, used on slaves, criminals, and prisoners of war. In fact, the word stigmes, the root of stigmatize, comes from the Greek word for these painful, permanent markings. They weren't art, they were punishment. These marks weren't symbolic or stylish. They were warnings, labels of shame etched in skin with malicious intent. If you were a runaway slave or a captured enemy in ancient Greece, your captors might tattoo your forehead with phrases like, "I ran, stop me," a living scarlet letter. A sentence served not in time, but in flesh. The Romans, ever efficient, took the idea and ran with it. Roman soldiers in elite legions were often tattooed to signify allegiance, a flesh-forged ID tag. But Rome also branded gladiators, slaves, and prisoners of war with equal ruthlessness. These weren't tattoos of identity, they were claims of ownership. And then came the darker twist. Early Christians, hunted and humiliated by Roman authorities, were sometimes forcibly tattooed to mark their faith as criminal. But centuries later, the same faith reclaimed the practice. Pilgrims who traveled to Jerusalem during the Middle Ages began returning with tiny cross tattoos on their forearms, a quiet, inked testament of devotion and endurance. What had once been a tool of torment became a badge of spiritual pride. Ironically, under Emperor Constantinetha, same ruler who legalized Christianity, tattooing the face was outlawed. Not because it was violent, but because he declared the human face was made in God's image, too sacred to defile. The body, though? Fair game. Unlike in Polynesia, where tattoos elevated your status, in the Greco-Roman world, they usually dragged it down. Tattoos marked you as lesser criminal, slave, outsider. Still, they told a story. Not always a story you chose, but one burned into your legacy. In societies built on law, order, and conquest, tattoos weren't personal expressions. They were weapons, tools of submission, punishment, and power. But, like all symbols of oppression, they wouldn't remain that way forever. While the West burned ink into criminals and slaves, the East offered something far more complex: sacredness, symbolism, and paradox. Let's begin in India. Most people know India for Mendith, intricate temporary henna art used during weddings and festivals. But India also boasts a long lineage of permanent tattooing, especially among tribal groups like the Baiga, Gond, and Santhal. For them, tattoos weren't random decorations. They were woven into identity, heritage, and protection. A tribal woman might carry symbols of fertility, strength, or devotion on her arms or forehead, not on a whim, but as part of a generational rite passed from grandmother to granddaughter. These marks were soul jewelry, eternal, untouchable, something no thief could steal and no hardship could erase. Meanwhile, in Japan, the tattoo story evolved through even sharper contrasts. In its early days, during the Jomon period, tattoos held spiritual meaning, possibly used to signify status or ward off spirits. But as the eras shifted, especially during the Edo period, tattoos became the ink of outcasts. Criminals were marked, faces, arms stamped with symbols denoting their crimes and hometowns. A permanent wanted poster etched in skin. Walk into a village, and everyone knew your past just by glancing at your arm. But from this shame, something rebellious and beautiful emerged. A counterculture of outcast firemen, dock workers, gamblers, and eventually, members of the Yakuza claimed tattoos not as disgrace, but honor. They developed irizumi, full-body masterpieces of dragons, tigers, koi, and deities. These designs were no quick ink jobs. They were emotional epics, told over hundreds of hours with hand tools and grit. Each image, a personal legend, worn beneath the judgment of society. And while this was happening in Japan, across Southeast Asia, a different spiritual ink was rising, the Sakyant tattoo. And sacred scriptures chanted into the skin with sharpened bamboo or steel rods. These were the Sakyant tattoos of Southeast Asia, etched by monks, empowered by mantra, and believed to grant strength, protection, and spiritual blessing. Each design was given not in silence, but accompanied by prayer, smoke, and ritual. In the East, ink lived on a razor's edge between holiness and heresy. Tattoos could brand you as sacred or shunned, hero or criminal. It all depended on the symbols and the soul beneath them. But one thing was always true: skin was never silent. It shouted with stories of prayer, power, punishment, and pride. As the Roman Empire crumbled and Christianity took its throne, the needle that once marked identity and punishment began to fade from Western skin. Why? Because in the eyes of the rising church, the body wasn't just a vessel, it was a temple. And temples, as the clergy sternly reminded, were not to be scribbled on. Early Christians had a complicated relationship with ink. Some still embraced it. Pilgrims journeying to Jerusalem often returned with tiny cross tattoos on their wrists, symbols of endurance, survival, and unshakable faith. These sacred etchings weren't rebellion, they were proof, a kind of divine passport showing they had walked the holy path and lived to tell the tale. But those were exceptions. The broader message was damning. By the early Middle Ages, religious authorities began cracking down hard. Tattoos were condemned as remnants of pagan rites. And to be pagan, that meant being sinful, heretical, dangerous. The Bible was pulled into the fight. Leviticus 19:28. You shall not make any cuttings in your flesh for the dead, nor tattoo any marks upon you. I am the Lord. One verse. That's all it took to bury an art form under centuries of fear. Tattoos were now associated with sorcery, devil worship, and outright heresy. Not something you wanted whispered about you in the time of inquisitions and burnings. So, in monasteries and Christian kingdoms, ink fell into shadow, but it never fully disappeared. Even amid fire and fear, the ink survived. In the distant reaches of the Byzantine Empire, certain Christian sects still marked themselves crosses on hands, arms, wrists etched as shields against Islamic enslavement. In the highlands of Ethiopia, Coptic Christians passed down tattoo traditions through sacred ritual. Young believers received marks of faith-visible prayers written in ink. Among crusaders, those steel-clad knights of God, tattoos made a ghostly comeback. Before they marched to the Holy Land, some etched tiny crosses into their bodies, not just for divine protection, but so that, if slain, they could be buried as Christian men. Their faith would still speak, even if their mouths no longer could. The West tried to silence tattooing, but it only drove it underground. Ink lingered in desert churches, pilgrim paths, and whispered monasteries waiting, like a relic, to rise again. And rise it did. When the age of exploration roared to life and wooden ships carved their names into the sea, tattooing found a brand new bearer. Sailors, not kings, not clerics, but rough, salt-crusted men shaped by waves and superstition. They decorated their bodies not with gold, but with anchors, stars, crucifixes, and sea beasts. And the rebirth of tattoos in Europe? It had a name, Captain James Cook. In the late 1700s, when Cook's ships reached Polynesia, his crew found entire cultures tattooed head to toe in breathtaking designs. Stunned and fascinated, many of Cook's sailors took ink home with them, not just as souvenirs, but as living proof that they'd been somewhere the maps barely named. Returning to port inked up wasn't vanity. It was a resume, a chronicle of places seen, storms survived, and legends lived. Tattoos had become the unofficial uniform of the seafaring soul. But this ink wasn't vanity. It was ritual, wrapped in superstition. An anchor on the forearm? It wasn't just nautical, it meant stability. Something to keep you grounded when the sea turned wild. Tattoos of pigs and roosters on the feet weren't meant to amuse. Sailors believed these animals, often kept in wooden crates that floated during shipwrecks, could magically prevent drowning. Hold fast, inked across the knuckles, was less decoration, more desperation, a grip spell, warding off storms and rope burns alike. Then came the divine, crosses etched into backs, the Virgin Mary tattooed over hearts. These weren't just symbols. They were spiritual armor for men whose enemies were invisible, in endless weather, hunger, the deep. And when these sailors came limping back to shore, their ink followed. Tattoos didn't infiltrate polite society. They soaked into the edges dock workers, soldiers, vagabonds, criminals. They became a new language of the lost, the brave, the broken. In America, Civil War soldiers began tattooing names and regiments on their arms not to show pride, but to ensure someone could name them if their body was found in a muddy field. Tattoos had become blood-signed insurance in a world without dog tags. So while kings and clergy looked down their powdered noses, the men who crossed oceans, fought wars, and mapped the unknown wore their stories with pride. Each mark, a prayer, a scar, a memory that couldn't be buried. By the 19th and 20th centuries, tattoos had traveled far from shrines and sacred rites. In many corners of the world, ink had entered the shadows, specifically behind bars. Prisons birthed a new tattoo language, brutal, codified, made with needles, razors, and desperation. Let's begin in Russia. Under the watchful eye of the Soviet Union, prison tattoos weren't art, they were biography, hierarchy, survival. A star on the shoulders meant you commanded fear. Barbed wire around the neck meant life without parole. A cathedral on your chest, each dome a sentence served. But this was sacred ground. Fake a mark you didn't earn, and you might wake up with it carved off by hand. In Japan, the Yakuza transformed irizumi, once a criminal mark, into a silent badge of honor. Full body tattoos, dragons, koi, samurai spread from shoulder to ankle like murals of myth. Worn under business suits, unseen by the public, known only to those within. Getting tattooed was a declaration of loyalty, costly, painful, irreversible. In the West, prison tattoos spoke their own secret dialect. In American jails, a teardrop below the eye might mean a murder committed or a loved one lost. Cobwebs on the elbows could symbolize time done. Dots, numbers, letter sync that told entire life stories in shorthand. These weren't made with proper machines. No parlor chairs, no clean lines, just melted pen ink, sharpened paper clips, and smuggled sewing needles. No glamour, just pain, blood, and raw identity. For many inmates, tattoos weren't about art, they were about belonging, or warning. Inside prison, ink was protection. Outside, it was a brand, a scarlet letter in black ink, a declaration. Untouchable, unredeemable. Society saw danger. But for the inked, those tattoos were often the only thing they still owned. A sliver of self no system could take away. Tattoos behind bars weren't style, they were survival. By the time the 20th century hit its stride, ink had shifted again from sacred and scorn to mainstream rebellion. Where the church once saw tattoos as marks of sin, the modern world began to see them as marks of freedom and sometimes a very particular brand of cool. In the early 1900s, tattoos were still a sideshow curiosity. You'd find them beneath circus tents, on the arms and backs of tattooed ladies and illustrated men. People paid admission just to stare. It was taboo, served on stage, wrapped in spectacle, and stitched with shock. But by the mid-20th century, something shifted. Soldiers returned from World War II, bearing ink-small, simple symbols. Anchors, eagles, hearts with mom scrolled through. These weren't for applause. They were keepsakes of pain, honor, and survival. Reminders of foxholes, fallen brothers, and the unspoken things left behind. These tattoos weren't decoration. They were memory. Then came the counterculture. The 1960s and 70s broke ink out of the military barracks and into the limelight. Rock stars, bikers, beat poets, they wore tattoos like armor and anarchy. Janis Joplin had a delicate bracelet tattooed on her wrist. The Hells Angels wore theirs like tribal creed. Getting tattooed became an act of rebellion, a silent declaration. I don't care what you think. Tattoo parlors, once hidden in back alleys and whispered about in bars, began to emerge into the light. Artists like Lyle Tuttle turned the needle into a storytelling tool. He inked icons like Cher and the Rolling Stones, transforming flesh into canvas, rebellion into art. Suddenly, tattoos weren't just expressions. They were statements, personal, political, powerful, but acceptance came slowly. Even through the 90s and early 2000s, having visible ink could cost you a job. No visible tattoos was printed on countless applications. Ink still whispered of deviance, especially for women, whose tattooed skin was judged more sharply. But the tide was rising. Tattoo reality shows hit television. Celebrities bared full sleeves. Conventions sprang up across cities. What had been subculture was now culture. From rebellion to runway, tattoos marched into the mainstream. But they never lost their edge. In an age where our voices live in the cloud and our memories are digitized, you'd think tattoos so analog, so raw might be left behind. Instead, tattoos have entered a renaissance, not just surviving the digital age, but evolving with it. Today, tattoos are tech-powered, app-designed, and machine-enhanced. Some artists use AI to generate hyper-realistic artwork. Others work with machines that ink with surgical precision. And then there are smart tattoo experimental patches with embedded sensors, tracking vitals, syncing with devices, even glowing with LED ink. No longer science fiction, it's happening in labs now. Even without the tech, tattoo culture is booming. Once taboo, now celebrated across every layer of society. Doctors with sleeves, teachers with wristbands of ink, CEOs stepping into boardrooms with entire galaxies hidden beneath their suits. Social media has supercharged the art. A tattoo done in Seoul can go viral in Seattle. Artists build global followings overnight. Booking an appointment? One tap away. And the meaning? If anything, it's deeper now, more personal. People tattoo the sound waves of loved ones' voices, coordinates of where they met their soulmate, portraits of pets, star maps of the night their child was born, quotes in ancient tongues, names long gone, remembered in ink, etched not for fashion, but for healing, for memory, for belonging. Cultural tattooing is surging back to life. From the frozen edges of the Arctic to the sun-scorched Andes, indigenous communities are reclaiming ancestral design stories once silenced, now carved proudly into skin. What was once outlawed is now worn like armor, not decoration, declaration, a living act of remembrance. Yet debates flare. Is tattooing sacred again or just another trend? Art or aesthetic? Can a story remain truly yours if it's filtered through algorithms and clout-chasing likes? But maybe that's the essence. Tattoos have always lived in that liminal space between pain and beauty, flesh and meaning. They're ancient yet futuristic, primal yet poetic, a whisper from our past, a roar into the future. And as long as humans seek to remember, to mark, to transform, ink will endure. Beneath the surface, it will always speak even when words fall short. Before empires clashed and soaked the earth in blood, before kings trembled at her name, she was just a girl of the wind. Tamias, born not to marble palaces or philosophical discourse, but to the wide, untamed steppe where life was hard, freedom sacred, and survival never guaranteed. She came from the Massaje, a tribe of fierce, nomadic horse archers who moved like shadows across the plains. They lived by the bow, the saddle, and the silence between wars. Little is known of her early years, but you can hear the rhythm of it if you listen. Hooves pounding over wild grasses, the snap of a bowstring before her voice had even learned to rise. Among the Massaje, daughters rode beside sons. There were no veils of silence, no cages of expectation. Girls learned to hunt, fight, bleed, and from the start, Tamias bled with purpose. Her people worshipped the open sky, honored their dead with weapons, and buried them ready for battle. They didn't build temples, they built pride. So when enemies came, they didn't pray, they drew arrows. Tamias rose not through inheritance, but through force. After the death of her husband, who may have ruled before her, she didn't wait to be crowned. She claimed command. In a world where women were often treated as property, she stood as a sovereign. She didn't whisper in the shadows, she spoke across campfires, across councils, across borders. And when kings failed to listen, she made them. She became more than a queen. She was Shahuda war chief, a tactician in bronze and leather, a voice the wind would not silence. But power never comes without shadow, especially not for women. As she fortified her leadership, whispers began to crawl through the wind. South of the mountains, one man was listening, Cyrus, known as the Great, and he wanted more. The steppe howled in anticipation, and Tamias, daughter of nomads, forge of fury, would soon ride into legend. While Tamias ruled the north, a very different kind of force was stirring in the south. Structured, ruthless, imperial. Cyrus the Great, founder of the Achaemenid Empire, had already swallowed Lydia in the west and Babylon in the south. His banners waved across deserts, mountains, and cities whose languages changed every 100 miles, but the horizon still called him. And Cyrus listened. The Massaje weren't drenched in gold, and they had no glittering cities, but they controlled something far more valuable: the northeastern frontier, key lands, trade routes, access. But most of all, they had something Cyrus couldn't ignore, something no empire could afford to overlook: pride. And pride, to an empire builder like Cyrus, was a flame, something to be bent or broken. But Cyrus, brilliant as he was, understood one truth: brute force didn't always win the first round. He had a reputation not just as a conqueror, but a schemer, a chess player in a world of warlords. So, before drawing a sword, he reached for a different weapon: diplomacy. Kings had done it before. Him used marriage to dissolve enemies without blood. He tried the same. According to ancient accounts, including Herodotus, Cyrus sent envoys with a proposal for Tamias, an alliance sealed by marriage. On parchment, it was regal. The mighty king of Persia and the fierce queen of the Massaje united. But Tamias saw through the silk. It wasn't love. It wasn't partnership. It was a velvet-gloved invasion. A takeover masked in vows. She declined with full awareness of the storm she'd just invited. The halls of Persepolis did not take rejection well. With diplomacy discarded, Cyrus returned to his native tongue war. He ordered his legions across the Araxes River, the natural border separating Persia from Massage territory. If he couldn't seduce the queen, he'd crush her. But Tamias was already moving. She knew the terrain, knew her warriors thrived on horseback, fast and ferocious. And more than anything, she understood this wasn't about conquest. It was about control. A woman had said no, and the most powerful king in the world had declared war for it. Cyrus, the master tactician, believed he could outmaneuver her. After all, he'd broken kings, razed cities, and humbled empires. What were these nomads with no walls to hide behind? He miscalculated. Tamias was not a wandering chieftain. She was a war-born strategist with fire in her blood and vengeance in her bones. She had warned him. After refusing the proposal, she sent word, "Cross the Araxes and you'll regret it." Cyrus crossed anyway. He built a bridge of boats to ferry his troops into Massaje land, confident in his plan. But Tamias didn't strike. Not yet. She pulled her army back, drawing the Persians into unfamiliar, open terrain. That's when they found Itan abandoned Massaje camp, filled with food and, crucially, wine. To Cyrus, it looked like a panicked retreat. To Tamias, it was the trap. Inside the camp, Cyrus left part of his force under General Harpagus, and then, under the cloak of night, the Massaje returned. They hit the camp with precise fury. The Persians were drunk, off guard, and overwhelmed. The slaughter was immediate, swift, devastating. Among the fallen was Spartans Tamias' son, a commander in her army. What happened next varies by telling. Some say he was captured, and in defiance took his own life. Others claim he fell in battle. But all sources agree when the news reached Tamias, something inside her broke and then reforged itself into steel. Her grief was raw, volcanic, but what rose from it was not sorrow. It was a rage so focused, it became prophecy. She sent a second message to Cyrus. No longer a warning, this was a death sentence. "You crave blood?" she wrote. "Then I will drown you in it." She vowed to flood the earth with Persian corpses. Her vengeance would not be whispered. It would be howled across the plains. Cyrus had stolen her son, tainted her homeland. Now he would face not a queen, but a mother hollowed by grief and filled with fire. The next battle wouldn't be fought. It would be delivered. The sun rose like a blade over the steppe cold, sharp, unrelenting, and Tamias, daughter of the wind, stood at the wing, head of her army, not just a queen anymore, but a storm made flesh. Her warriors, forged in fire and hunger, painted their faces with ash and wrath. This wasn't politics now. This was blood. Cyrus had made one critical mistake. He underestimated the Massaje, thought they would break like the wild tribes he'd crushed before. Disordered, scattered, easy to erase. But Tamias had grown up among warriors. She knew war wasn't won by rage, it was won by rhythm, precision, timing. And now, she struck. She gathered her forces for one final assault on the Persian army. No more traps, no more waiting. This was war in full voice. The place of the last battle has vanished from maps devoured by the endless steppe, but what happened there scorched itself into memory. Tamias unleashed her cavalry in a wave of controlled fury, a tide of blades and arrows. They fired from horseback, closed in with iron axes, and fought like souls who had already faced death and survived. The Persians, hardened, seasoned, trained for the grand fields of empire, weren't ready for this. Not this fury, not this unity, not Tamias. She didn't command from the rear. She rode beside them, her presence like fire in their veins. Every blow they struck was a hymn to her fallen son. Every charge, a chorus of vengeance. Cyrus tried to rally his men. He tried to hold the lines, but the lines dissolved. Persians fell where they stood. Others ran, vanishing into the grasslands only to be hunted down. And then, in the chaos, Cyrus, the Great, fell. The man who had conquered Babylon, Lydia, and stretched the edges of the known world, was silenced. Some say he died in battle, struck down by a Massaje warrior. Others claim he was captured and executed. Either way, he died on Tamias' terms. What happened next is legend. According to Herodotus, she found his body on the blood-soaked field. She ordered the head severed. Then, in a final gesture of brutal poetry, she dropped it into a wineskin filled with human blood. "Drink your fill," she said, "of the blood you so thirsted for." Was it true? Was it embellished? Maybe both, but it didn't matter. The message was immortal. Tamias could not be conquered. When the dust settled and the steppe drank the blood of empires, it was she who remained unbent, unbeaten. She had done what no other leaderman or monarch had. She had brought Cyrus the Great to his knees. News of his fall echoed across the ancient world. The mighty Achaemenid Empire, the machine of conquest, had been humbled by a woman of the steppe. Persia tried to minimize the story, but the death of their founder couldn't be buried, no matter how grand the tomb at Pasargadae. For Tamias and the Massaget, it was more than vengeance. It was a declaration. We are not prey. We are not pawns. We are sovereign. We are proud. And when the wind blows through our homeland, it carries our name like a blade. After her victory, Tamias vanished from the annals of history. No scrolls record her twilight years. No tomb has ever been found. It was as if, having made her point in fire and blood, she simply rode back into the steppe and let the horizon claim her again. And yet, she never disappeared. In the centuries that followed, her name was stitched into legend. Historians, poets, bards, they all tried to catch her shadow. To Persians, she was a scar that never healed. To Greeks, a paradox barbarian by geography, but nobler than many kings. And to the people of Central Asia, she became something more than history. She became myth, a spectral queen still said to ride the wind-swept steppe affairs, unbroken, wielding a blade that never forgot. Tamias became more than memory. She became muse. Across the centuries, artists reimagined her in ink and pigment. Medieval manuscripts cast her in regal armor, commanding armies with fire in her eyes. Renaissance painters depicted her towering over the fallen body of Cyrus, queen and conqueror alike. In every era, she was reborn into the symbol people needed most. An avenging mother, a wild queen, a cautionary tale, a hymn to feminine power. But peel back the legend and one truth cuts like steel through the smoke. She changed history. Tamias didn't inherit power, she forged it in blood and rebellion. And for one blinding, irreversible moment, the queen of the steppe proved that not all empires rise. Some crumble beneath the hooves of warriors with grief in their hearts and fire in their bones. Most of what we know about Tamias doesn't come from her people. The Massaget left no palaces or parchment scrolls. Their memory wasn't carved in stone, it rode the wind. It was the Greek Herodotus, the so-called father of history, who gave her name permanence. A century after her time, he penned her tale, a queen of blistering resolve, unmatched wrath, and legendary vengeance. But Herodotus wasn't a reporter. He was a weaver of stories, his histories part record, part parable. To his Greek audience, Tamias stood as a mirror flipped against empire. Cyrus the Great, the man who broke kingdoms like clay pots, was felled not by a rival state but by a mother who went to war for her child, not her crown. Herodotus made it myth. He wrote of her revenge, the severed head, the wineskin of blood. Drink your fill, she spat at the corpse of empire. Is it fact? Is it embellishment? Modern historians are divided. Some claim Herodotus dramatized the account, casting Tamias as a moral blade to slice Persian pride, a pointed warning, in a time when Persia still loomed over Greece. Others argue the tale rings with too much truth to be dismissed. Perhaps the blood-soaked wine bag was symbolic, but the death, the humiliation, likely real. There's also the matter of bias. Herodotus viewed the Massaget through a Greek lens, wild, untamed yet noble, foreign but reflective. In his framing, Tamias wasn't a barbarian. She was justice. She was reckoning. But even if the story twisted with time, Herodotus did one thing that can't be erased. He ensured Tamias would never fade. She didn't end up a forgotten footnote. She became folklore, myth wrapped in memory. A queen among conquerors, her defiance echoing louder than any throne. And there lies the paradox. Tamias, who ended the life of an emperor, never ruled an empire. She didn't build cities, commission statues, or etch laws into gold. Her people, the Massaget, were nomads, free spirits who followed herds, stars, and survival. No great stone stood to commemorate her. No coin bore her name. Instead, her legend lived the only way the steppe ever kept its history, through stories, through the crackle of firelight, the rhythms of song, the breathless awe of warriors who whispered her name before battle. The Massaget were one tribe among many: the Scythians, the Saka, the the Dahai horse archers, who ruled the lands between the Caspian Sea and the farthest shadows of ancient China. To empires, they were a nightmare, fast, untethered, and fierce. And though Tamius was rare, she wasn't singular. Steppe culture granted women freedoms most civilizations refused. They rode, they hunted, fought, and led. Among the Scythians, archaeologists have unearthed the graves of female warriors buried with bows, blades, armor, and horse tack. Proof, carved in the earth, that the tales of steppe queens weren't just fireside fantasies, they were real. Tamius stood at the summit of that legacy. Her authority came not from crown or creed, but from sheer force of will. She united scattered tribes not with gold, but grit. She led not from a throne, but from the saddle commanding armies in a land where survival meant outpacing the wind, shooting straighter, and fearing nothing. And yet, because the Massaje carved no stone, raised no obelisks, Tamius became a ghost, a queen remembered in whispers. Her name preserved only by foreign scribes and the songs that rode the breath of the steppe. To the Persians, she was a caution etched in blood. To the Greeks, a marvel clad in paradox. To her people, a legend braided into bloodlines and battle cries. A spirit riding the plains beside them still. Empires crumble into dust, but the steppe sings its stories on the wind. And Tamios' fears, grieving, undefeated, became its voice. Time marched on. The empires that once surrounded the Massage rose, clashed, collapsed. Cyrus's heirs built Persepolis, clashed with Alexander, and faded into the footnotes of dusty tomes. But her name, her flame, it endured not in palaces or politics, but in the pulse of those who never bowed. Across Central Asia, she was no longer just a queen. She became a symbol of female strength, of unbreakable resistance, of the steppe itself untamed, untethered. She was not Roman, nor Greek, nor Persian. Her story belonged to no empire. That made it dangerous. That made it eternal. In the medieval Islamic world, chroniclers mentioned her name warped by dialect, but still resonant. In some accounts, she was revered for her unflinching justice. In others, feared as a savage sovereign, a reminder that power in the hands of a woman could be as awe-inspiring as it was terrifying. By the Renaissance, Europe rediscovered her through the ink of Herodotus. Painters rendered her in gleaming armor, standing over Cyrus's corpse like a storm crowned in steel. In one dramatic canvas, she raises his severed head like a trophy triumphant, blood-soaked, and utterly unforgettable. It was theatrical, it was political, and it was revolutionary. A woman who didn't just survive the man's world, she conquered it. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Tamius emerged as a nationalist icon across Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan. Poets sang of her, schools taught her, statues were raised. Her image returned to ceremony, to celebration, to rebellion. A woman once feared on horseback was now riding again through memory, through myth, through the hearts of the proud. And in a world still wrestling with the weight of female power, Tamius remains a challenge. She wasn't soft, she wasn't saintly, she wasn't convenient, she was fierce, merciless when she had to be, compassionate only where it was earned. She was resistance made flesh, and the blood of empires on her hands, she wore it like a crown. History loves its kings, its stone carvers, its lawgivers, those who inscribe their legacy into monuments and tablets. But Tamius wrote hers in dust and fire. She left no empire, no palace, no golden seal, and yet her name still rides. Not because she ruled forever, but because she dared to fight and never bowed, refused to be erased. Tamius stands as a rebellion against how history usually writes women not as footnotes or shadows, but as forces of reckoning. She didn't ask for recognition. She seized it blood-washed, fire-forged. She didn't ride beside a king. She rode against one, and she won. Her story lives in classrooms, from Central Asia to Europe, not just because she defeated Cyrus the Great, but because she dared to say no. She didn't fight to protect palaces or flags. She fought for freedom. A kind of freedom no empire could defy, known that rode on the backs of wild horses, hunted with hawks, and slept beneath stars. Freedom that couldn't be boxed into borders or carved into stone maps. Today, her likeness rises in bronze across Kazakhstan. Her face graces coins. Her name echoes through textbooks. To the people of Central Asia, she is not just a warrior. She is the mother of nations. A link to a pre-Islamic, pre-Soviet, proudly nomadic past. A bold reminder that their roots were not planted in submission, but galloped into being on war cries and hooves. In a world still divided by power, gender, and selective memory, Tamias remains a beacon, not just for her triumph, but for what she taught. That dignity is not granted, it is claimed. That sometimes leadership is not robes and thrones, but a grieving mother who refuses to let the killer walk away. Why do some names echo through time while others vanish into the dust? Tamias endured because she was unforgettable. In an era where women were told to vanish behind tents and veils, she rose with a blade in hand, a storm in her chest, and carved her legacy into the skin of history. Empires crumble, statues wither, but legends, they ride. And somewhere, in the wind's low whisper across the steppe, the queen still gallops undefeated, untamed, unforgettable. Long before fingerprint scanners and retina locks, before satellites mapped our doors and passwords guarded our lives, the question was far simpler yet just as urgent. How do I protect what's mine? Before digital firewalls, there were real ones. Before motion detectors, there were wolves at the door and thieves at your gate. As humanity shifted from nomadic wanderers to settled dwellers, one thing became certain: where there are possessions, there will be problems. Envy, theft, invasion. And so was born the first spark of a new kind of genius, not how to build wealth, but how to protect it. The instinct to shield what matters is ancient, primal. The moment early humans began stockpiling grain, guarding tools, or housing sacred objects in temples or dwellings, they needed something to stand guard when they couldn't, something mechanical, relentless, silent. And that something was the lock. 4,000 years ago, in the dry, brilliant lands of ancient Egypt, that need took shape. And what they created wasn't just functional, it was brilliant. The world's first known mechanical lock, made of wood, pins, pegs, and insight. Ingeniously simple, stunningly effective. A wooden bolt, bored with holes, secured by gravity-fed pins. Insert the right key and equally carved wooden rodin. The pins lifted, the bolt slid, the door opened. Remove the key and gravity snapped it shut again. No keys, no entry, no guessing, no brute force. These weren't crude barriers. They were puzzles. Riddles guarding tombs, treasure rooms, and temple gates, installed on the inside, hidden from tampering hands. Primitive? By today's standards, perhaps. But the elegance of the logic remains untouched, because a lock is never just a doorstop. It's a message. What lies beyond this point matters. And the Egyptians didn't just build barriers, they built foresight. These ancient engineers feared theft. Yes, but more than that, they anticipated it. And in doing so, they unlocked a field that would grow, evolve, and one day run the world. Security wasn't born in the digital age. It was born in dust, wood, and pins. So next time you twist your house key, click your padlock shut, or slide the bolt across your front door, remember, you're not just securing your space. You're echoing a tradition that began 4,000 years ago, shaped by hands that worked under the desert sun. Because at its heart, every lock speaks the same truth. Some things are worth guarding. That ancient Egyptian wooden pin lock wasn't just the first mechanical lock, it was the ancestor of nearly every pin tumbler mechanism we use today. A marvel of simplicity, elegance, and genius. For centuries, it guarded temples, granaries, and sacred chambers. And it all started with a few carved wooden pegs and the human desire to say, "This is mine." Picture it. A towering wooden doorknob swinging on hinges like today, but a vertical slab sealing off the unknown. On the inner side, a horizontal bolt rests. Inside that bolt, several vertical holes. In those holes, Wooden pins. Those pins fall into slots carved into the door frame, locking the bolt in place. It's secure. Now comes the magic. The key, a large wooden device, not unlike a modern toothbrush, is carved with corresponding pegs that align perfectly with the pins. Inserted, and the pegs lift the pins just enough to clear the slots. The bolt slides. The door opens. Remove the key and gravity drops the pins back in. No springs, no gears, just wood, weight, and wisdom. It was mechanical memory centuries before metalworking could mimic it. What made this lock so extraordinary wasn't just how well it worked, it was how it balanced complexity with accessibility. You didn't need bronze or iron to build one, just craftsmanship. And since each was hand-carved, no two locks were alike. Your key, your key. These locks weren't just for pharaohs. Excavations at places like Nineveh and even Persian Assyrian sites show that the concept traveled far beyond Egypt. The lock had legs. It became a cultural innovation, adopted and adapted. But beyond functionality, these locks carried deeper meaning. In tombs and temples, locking a door didn't just say, "keep out." It said, "only the worthy may enter." To lock something was to venerate it, declare it sacred. Final, access wasn't just a matter of strength, it was a matter of legitimacy. And while Egypt gave us the world's first locks, another ancient society pioneered a very different kind of security, one that didn't stop access, but made unauthorized access unmistakable. Welcome to Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, where trust wasn't locked behind bolts, but pressed into clay. Here, in cities like Uruk, Babylon, and Nineveh, people didn't rely on mechanics alone. They relied on identity. The tool, cylinder, seals. Tiny stone rollers, meticulously engraved with unique patterns, images, or inscriptions. These seals were rolled over soft clay used to close storage jars, tablets, Door 7 legal contracts. Think signature, stamp, and barcode, all in one. Once pressed, they left behind a continuous designer, personal, unforgeable mark of authority. If anyone tried to tamper with the sealed item, break the door, open the jar, unroll the document, the damage to the clay told on them. Instantly, visibly, no hiding it, no denying it. Security in Mesopotamia wasn't silent. It was public, obvious. A broken seal wasn't just an inconvenience, it was evidence. It told the world exactly who had dared. In ancient Mesopotamia, high-ranking officials, merchants, and priests each carried their own personalized cylinder, seals unique as fingerprints. These weren't just tools, they were legacy, symbols of trust, wealth, and lineage. Some people were even buried with their seals, believing the afterlife, too, had doors that only their mark could open. But clay wasn't the only canvas for Mesopotamian security. They also protected temples and granaries with rope bindings tied in elaborate knots, sealed in wax, and fastened in ways that revealed the slightest tampering. To steal, you didn't just have to be bold. You had to be invisible, and that, for most, was impossible. The message was clear. Security wasn't just about keeping things out. It was about making violation visible. The threat of exposure became more terrifying than the reward of theft. It was accountability as security, and that idea, that access should be tied to identity and status, still echoes today. Every time we log in with usernames, sign receipts, or leave a digital footprint, we're echoing Mesopotamia's old truth. To guard something isn't just to hide it. It's to claim it, publicly, as yours and dare others to touch it. As ancient Greece rose in splendor, city-states filled with coin hoards, temple treasuries, and private estates, the challenge of security returned. How do you protect what matters when you can't always be there? Surprisingly, the Greeks lagged behind their Egyptian and Mesopotamian predecessors in lock mechanics. But that didn't mean they lacked solutions. They leaned on culture, trust, and physical barriers, sometimes aided by clever, if crude, devices. One such mechanism was the bar and pin lock. Simple, practical. A horizontal bar blocked the door from inside. From outside, a key, often a flat iron rod shaped like an F or P, could lift it through a slot. These keys weren't subtle. Some were nearly as long as a forearm, Carrying one made your intentions clear. You had something worth guarding. But Greek locks weren't just functional. They were symbolic. To hold a key was to hold authority. In Homer's Odyssey, Penelope doesn't just have access. She holds the key to Odysseus's storeroom, a quiet symbol of her power within the household. Keys in Greece weren't mere tools. They were trust, made tangible. Still, Greek locks had flaws. Many were basic, easy to force, and relied more on size than ingenuity. So, the real strength of Greek security lay elsewhere in layered access, social custom, and the presence of people. Homes were built with choke points, multiple rooms, inner gates, doors that barred from within. Wealthy citizens employed guards or enslaved servants to watch their valuables. Temples and treasuries were locked not by one man, but by many, requiring several officials and multiple keys to open sacred chambers. The Greeks prized clever nesmetis, cunning intelligence, but hadn't yet channeled that trait into lockmaking, not the way others would. Still, they laid a crucial foundation: the key as power, access as status, and security as a dance between trust and control. But then came the Romans. Engineers, bureaucrats, masters of metal. The Romans didn't just build locks, they refined them into art. With their obsession for order, skill in metallurgy, and sprawling empire demanding control, the Romans brought something new to the table: precision, portability, and innovation. And their influence echoes in our locks today. The Romans, masters of metal and mechanics, ushered in a golden era of secure design. With access to bronze and iron, they could create smaller, more intricate, and far more durable locks than anything carved from wood. They didn't just adopt the Egyptian pin tumbler system, they reimagined it. Roman locksmiths introduced warded locks, ingenious mechanisms built with internal barriers that only allowed a correctly shaped key to rotate inside. No crude tools or makeshift picks would do. The key had to match the wards precisely. It was security through structure, and a nightmare for intruders. And those keys? They were masterpieces. Forged from iron or bronze, Roman keys came in all forms, from massive staff-sized keys for city gates to elegant ring keys worn like jewelry. Yes, some keys were designed to be worn on the hand, both practical and symbolic. A Roman citizen didn't just carry protection, they wore it. Access, identity, status, all in one shining circle of metal. But the true genius of Roman security lay in their puzzle locks. Devices so cunning they'd make modern escape room designers blush. These weren't just tools, they were traps. Misalign the key, press the wrong latch, twist at the wrong angle, and instead of opening, the lock would tighten. These weren't just used for treasure, they were used for secrets, political scrolls, sacred relics, even poison caches. Rome didn't just use locks, it systematized them. Military depots, merchant chests, banking vaults, everything was under lock and iron key. Doors bore brass plates, gates slid with reinforced bars, and slaves were sometimes bound with iron collars, the key held by their masters. To the Romans, a lock was never just a latch. It was a symbol of power, a line drawn in iron between who belonged and who didn't. As Rome forged its legacy in metal, another civilization approached security with a blend of pragmatism and philosophy. Ancient China, where the West pursued complexity and flair, Chinese engineers leaned toward minimalism and symbolism. Their locks were durable, compact, and deeply meaningful. A lock didn't just protect, it spoke. The most common mechanism? The sliding bolt lock. Crafted from bronze or iron, it consisted of a hollow metal case containing a bolt secured by spring-loaded tumblers. When the correct key, a flat, ribbed metal stick, was inserted, the tumblers aligned, allowing the bolt to slide free. Sound familiar? That's because the core principle behind today's pin tumbler locks was already in place in Han Dynasty China, circa 200 BCE. Where Roman locks flaunted their mechanics, Chinese locks were compact, discreet, often hidden in plain sight. Used to secure chests, jewelry, doors, they weren't just functional, they were spiritual. Many were cast in the shapes of animals: dragons for protection, turtles for longevity, fish for prosperity. A dragon-shaped lock on a door was more than security. it was a warning. A symbolic sentinel guarding what lay beyond. Locks even played ceremonial roles. During weddings, symbolic boxes were secured with love locks. The key was handed to the new spouse, a gesture of trust, union, and destiny. And just like their Roman counterparts, Chinese engineers delighted in deception. Puzzle locks featured decoy keyholes, hidden latches, and sequences that confounded the uninvited. These weren't just locks. They were riddles. Not because they were impossible to break, but because they slowed you down. In the ancient world, delay could mean everything. A foiled theft, a second chance, a priest catching you mid-act. Time, not just toughness, was the lock's true weapon. Ultimately, Chinese security wasn't about brute exclusion. It was about harmony between practicality, symbolism, and cleverness. Locks were more than barriers. They were statements. They told stories. And in that quiet balance of form and function, China forged a legacy of security that endures to this day in discrete mechanisms and ceremonial gestures alike. Meanwhile, in ancient India, security was something else, entirely a dance between concealment, spirituality, and craft. Here, the focus wasn't on brute force, but on deception, mystery, and layered meaning. Locks weren't just built to block, they were built to confuse. Puzzle locks and trick mechanisms were everywhere from temple vaults to treasure chests. They weren't impenetrable, but they were designed to mislead, frustrate, and warn. One lock might require pressing a hidden button, twisting a disguised lever, and then turning the key. Another had false keyholes that led nowhere, daring thieves to waste precious time. Temple security in particular became an art form. Sacred offerings of gold, manuscripts, and relics weren't merely locked away, they were sealed by ritual. Wax stamps, knotted ropes, clay emblems marked with priestly authority. To break these wasn't just theft, it was blasphemy. Even the locks themselves bore power. They were carved with elephants, lotus blossoms, mantras, and guardian deities. To lay uninvited hands on one was to risk divine wrath. These weren't just devices. They were sacred warnings, talisman and trap-in-one. In royal courts and merchant caravans, small portable locks secured everything from scroll cases to trade boxes. Crafted from iron or brass, they were light, durable, and often entirely unique. In some cases, a single artisan crafted both the lock and the key, ensuring that only one person in the world held the secret. And like in China, locks in India also played ceremonial roles. During weddings, inheritance rituals, or religious rites, unlocking a box didn't just mean material access. It meant transfer of duty, of trust, of legacy. In ancient India, the best lock didn't just protect, it puzzled, it guarded, and it whispered, "Only the rightful may pass." As empires expanded and Silk Roads connected Rome to China, a new need emerged: mobility. Security wasn't just about locking temple doors, it was about moving protection across deserts, through markets, on warpaths. Trade exploded. Chinese silk flowed west. Indian spices burned their way across borders. Roman glassware, Byzantine coinage, and scrolls from Alexandria crisscrossed continents. But prosperity brought predators. Bandits roamed roads, porters turned pickpockets, and valuables often journeyed far from their owners' watchful eyes. The solution? Portable, tamper-resistant locks. Roman merchants favored compact iron padlocks, simple, sturdy, and battle-tested. They secured chests, saddlebags, and warehouse gates alike. These lock-small yet resilient often featured spring-loaded mechanisms and iron ring keys. They weren't impenetrable, but they were robust enough to stop casual theft and light enough to carry across continents. Archaeologists have found them from Britain to Syria, buried in crumbling ruins and recovered from rusted shipwrecks. Their reach tells a bigger story: security on the move. A shared need that transcended borders, protecting wealth in motion. Chinese traders, too, used portable bronze sliding locks, typically fastened to carts or chest handles. Some were hidden in plain sight, designed to blend in as ornamentation or embedded into the box itself. Many were engraved with characters or symbols of ownership. Break the lock, And it wasn't just theft. It was a public stain prosecuted as crime and branded as dishonor. Nomadic tribes of Central Asia developed their own systems leather straps, secured with metal rings and clasps. These weren't elaborate, but they were quick and obvious, designed to be checked at a glance. Whether securing tent flaps, saddlebags, or weapon cases, their purpose was clear. If something had been touched, you'd know instantly. On the battlefield, locks weren't optional. They were vital. Command tents, supply wagons, weapon crates. Everything had to be protected, sometimes from enemies, sometimes from allies. Scrolls, maps, and strategic documents were locked in cases requiring two officers to open them, an ancient precursor to two-factor authentication. Trust was coded into the mechanism. Across cultures and eras, one truth held steady. As people moved more, their locks had to think faster. The road promised fortune, but it whispered danger. And ancient travelers answered that whisper not just with blades, but with keys. When we turn a deadbolt today, or swipe a passcode into a screen, we rarely think about the invisible story behind that simple act. But every click, slide, and unlock is part of a tale written in Egyptian temples, Roman marketplaces, Chinese caravans, and Indian courts. The true legacy of ancient locks isn't just mechanical, it's emotional, psychological. These tools reflect a human truth, our deep, instinctive need to protect, to claim, to draw a line between what's ours and what isn't. Whether it was a wooden bolt guarding grain in Thebes, a ring key tucked into a tunic in Pompeii, or a trick box in Chang'an, the message was always the same. This belongs to someone. You are not that someone. Over time, those locks became more than barriers. They became symbols. A bolt on a temple door didn't just block thieves, it preserved the sacred. A seal on a scroll didn't just keep out ISIT-marked power. Even now, we use locks to encode trust. A locked journal, a wedding chest, a safe full of memories. The technology has advanced, but the meaning has barely changed. And that might be the most extraordinary part. Today's pin tumbler locks mirror Egyptian wood designs. Modern privacy seals, digital passcode 7 blockchain encryption echo, ancient principles, restricted access, tamper evidence, symbolic control. It's the same human story, told in silicon and steel. But here's the twist. No lock, ancient or modern, is perfect. Everyone can be broken. Everyone can be picked. So what makes a lock powerful? Not the mechanism, but the message. A lock doesn't just deny access. It declares it. It says, "This is mine. You have no permission." And that simple psychological line, that invisible boundary, is what makes security real. From dusty tombs to roaring trade routes, from the hush of temple halls to the firelit corners of homes, locks have always meant more than protection. They mean identity, secrets, power, sometimes even survival. So next time you hear that soft click of safety, know this. You're not just locking a door. You're turning a page in a story written by merchants, warriors, priests, and kings. Each of them merchants, queens, generals, and nomads putting faith in a humble mechanism, a bit of wood, a sliver of bronze, a loop of iron, trusting in that fragile creation, the power to hold back the chaos of the world, to say, "This is mine, this is sacred, this is safe." And now, so do we.